Go home today. I wanted to review this piece on the Andreessen Horowitz site. I've had tons and tons of folks ask me about it, and so I just haven't had the time to go through it, and thought now would be a good time to do that. So investing in the podcast ecosystem in 2019, this is obviously written from a venture capitalist's perspective, so maybe it'll be interesting to hear it from the perspective of a bootstrapper. Let me bring up chat just in case anybody wants to add their 2 cents, but I'm not going to read the whole thing verbatim, but maybe just highlight the parts that kind of stick out to me. So perspective of a bootstrapper. Let's see here. From niche internet community to 1/3 of Americans. So podcast consumption is rapidly growing. I don't know if it's actually rapidly growing. It seems like these increases are 10 to 15% year over year or something like that. When I look at this chart, this seems really quite gradual to me. And so, maybe the rate's increasing. Still doesn't look like a hockey stick chart yet to me, but let's see what else we have here. Podcast listeners are consuming 6 hours per week and more content every year. Of course, that's the thing about podcasting, isn't it? Is that people listen. People who are into them are really into them. They listen to them a lot, and so that doesn't surprise me. Let's see. Demographics of podcast listeners, not your average American. Roughly half makes $75,000 or more. Majority have a post-secondary degree. There's a gender gap with podcast listeners skewing mostly male. One thing I have noticed that I don't think they mentioned in the report is on Spotify, we're noticing a lot more podcast listeners are female. So I think the Spotify's push into podcasting has actually evened out a lot of those gender disparities, or is evening it out. Let's see here. We have years following. So it used to be people would listen on their desktop, and now of course people are listening on their smartphone. That makes sense. Computer is number 2. Tablet is number 3. Other. This is the funny part too, is that everyone's always talking about smart speakers. Smart speakers has not become a major place, a major listening medium for podcasts yet. And what may surprise people living in heavy commuter markets is that listening primarily happens at home. That's interesting. That's actually a little bit surprising to me. I would expect that a lot more of it would happen on the road. Let's see here. Car truck is only 26%, so 48% of folks are listening while they're walking the dog or doing the dishes or something else. So we've got a history of podcasting. What's this? This is a Google Trends graph over time. Is that what that is? Yeah, you got Serial, you've got Google launching. Where do they mention Spotify on here? Incidentally, Spotify, in terms of the history of podcasting, has been, I think, the biggest driver of new listeners. So lots of people are discovering through Apple Podcasts and maybe popular shows like Serial, but Spotify is what's driving things. This Google launching their podcast app in 2018, that's been a failure. Not nearly as much as many folks listening on Google Podcasts. Although that could change now that they are including search results. Build your SaaS podcast. Now, if you search for a podcast, episodes are showing up right inside of search results, and you can play them like right here. So that could have a huge effect on podcasting, especially discoverability, and especially as they start to transcribe the actual audio and index that and show that inside of the podcast apps. So I can see that being a bigger thing for sure. All right, let's keep going here. The app landscape. So Apple Podcasts is still the dominant app for listening. I wonder if this is a little bit old data here, because I think Spotify is, in some markets, is at least 40 to 50% of listens now. But Apple Podcasts is definitely still a big chunk of that, 50 to 60%, depending on which market you look at. And they've got also, here's the other podcast listening apps. Odd that they don't mention Overcast in here, because Overcast would certainly be a bigger player than Breaker, Pocket Cast is still huge, relatively, Castbox is not as big in North America, but I've heard it's bigger in other markets. So, okay, so now they start talking about Spotify, which is, definitely, they are increasing every year. Just, they have so many subscribers already that for them to add podcasts, it just makes sense that more people would be, listening inside of Spotify. And then they talk about the extreme power curve, how, the creator landscape reflects a power law dynamic where, the top 1% has most of the downloads. The median podcast only has 124 downloads per episode. Another stat I've heard, and that's reflected in Transistor's data as well, is 80% of podcasts won't get more than 1,100 downloads per episode in the first 30 days. So, these shows with the big downloads, that's the top 1%. I can agree with that. Although one thing we're finding is that depending on what your goal is, you don't need hundreds of thousands of downloads to, to get advertisers, to grow fan base, to, use it as a vehicle for connecting with your customers, or for getting new customers. We have podcasts on Transistor that they have, maybe 500 downloads per month, and they regularly get new leads from their podcasts, and it's been a real worthwhile investment for them. So let's see what else we got here. We've got They talk about the different types. Okay, top podcast snapshot. Okay, so then they talk about how people make money from podcasting, ads and sponsorships, donations, tipping, and paid content. And then they also have branded content, subscription membership, and other. I think this is pretty good overview. Again, there's all sorts of folks doing different things, and it depends on what your goal is for the show. And so we have folks on Transistor that make most of their money from advertisements, from sponsors. Other folks make most of their money from Patreon. And other folks are just using it as a vehicle for building up their brand, whether they're a repair shop or authors or whatever. There's lots of folks using podcasts for different things. And honestly, some nonprofits, universities, etc., are using it, sometimes just as a communication vehicle. So podcast revenue is growing. It's still quite small compared to, radio and other forms of advertising. They have this little chart right here. Podcasting is that little sliver, and they're saying podcasts monetize at only 1 cent per listener hour on average, 10 times less than radio. Although, I don't know, that's a little bit disingenuous because some podcasts are that the costs to produce those shows is much less, and also, a podcast can be a couple hours long, but have a staff of one. And so are we talking about revenue? What would be interesting is revenue per employee or revenue per creator, revenue per show. I'll bet you it's much higher than radio. So why is podcast monetization so low? Again, I disagree with that. I don't think that's actually accurate. It's only low per hour. when you put it on this metric, right? It's per listener hour. Well, if you're going to, it's low in that sense. But again, if we're talking about revenue per creator, revenue per host, that's no. And in fact, not having the ability to monetize directly on these platforms, I think, is an advantage. So I don't, this is not, this is kind of like creating a little bit of a straw man. How much are podcasts making? Tim Ferriss is saying that he could make between $2 to $4 million per year. I've said that Joe Rogan, what did I say? I think he's making $25 to $50 million a year in podcast revenue. So if he's the top, that's pretty good. And I mean, I don't know how big his staff is. Is it just him and that guy Jamie? It's pretty good. $25 to $50 million in revenue just from that. Right. Okay, let's keep going. Audio trends and lessons from China. Yeah, I still want to know because there's all sorts of folks saying that podcasts are monetizing in China at this really high rate, but is that just from one news story? Because they're looking at this Zimalaya app, and podcasting is more like on-demand audio courses in China. So And actually, I read somewhere else that a lot of this is government sponsored. So it really is a model that might not work in North America. I'll find the source for that, but so against the larger backdrop of venture-backed company, the experts were still small. They go through kind of the exits here. As a bootstrapper, I don't really pay as much attention to this, we had some big exits, Gimlet and Anchor and those other ones, but we're seeing revenue grow 25% month over month right now, and so maybe that's not a big enough market for venture capitalists, but there's certainly some good things going on here. All right, startup trends. We've got podcast investment over time. So this is how much some folks are wondering if we're in a podcast bubble. Let's look at the market map. Weird that podcast production companies. It's weird that I don't see any of the podcast hosting or analytics companies listed here. Given the challenges with monetization, how can startups create paths to becoming profitable? With the distribution capital advantage, consumer traction awareness, large budgets for content production acquisition. We think the most promising players will combine the following aspects. Focus on audio content broadly rather than exclusively podcasts. Okay, maybe. Paid podcasts, we'll see if that works. The potential for network effects. Yeah, although the network effect everybody seems to forget is word of mouth, which, if people are talking about podcasts in coffee shops, then that's a good sign. That is a network effect. When people are, discussing what shows they should listen to, when they're recommending shows to each other, that's a pretty strong network effect. Maybe it's not as viral as some other things, but podcasts are so much more sticky. Once you subscribe, you stay subscribed for a long time. High quality differentiator and deeper consumption experience that enhances the experience of audio content. Alternative monetization behind solely ads. Okay, so now Andreessen Horowitz is kind of saying these are the things they want to invest in. Vertical audio platforms. And they have very fitness apps and meditation well-being apps, interactive and audio, social audio. I think this is true. I think podcasting could be more interactive, like call-ins to radio and live talk shows where, that was a big part of it. Twitch has podcasters who use the platform to live stream. Yeah. So I can see that. Although, again, the reason people are using podcasts is because it is, you download it and then you listen to it while you go for a walk, or you download it and then you listen to it when you're in the car. It would be cool if there's more interactivity you could do while you're listening. Like if I could, push on this button here and leave a voice message at that given timestamp for in a podcast app. That would be cool. All right, and that's kind of it. Okay, so I needed to read that, so I'm glad I got through it now. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think it clearly the venture capital folks are looking more on the consumer side. They want some big wins, and so for us we're more on the B2B, B2prosumer side. It doesn't seem to apply to us as much. There's a lot of information in there that's kind of already out in public that people know about. I think I see some interesting things and opportunities that maybe Andreessen Horowitz didn't notice, and maybe I'll talk about those in a future live stream. Have a good day, everyone. Talk to you next time I go live.